Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Sports Psych Talk podcast, India ka apna sports talk show. My name is Urvi Shah, and I am a sports and counseling psychologist. And today we have a very esteemed sports psychologist joining us, Dr. Urvi Khasnis. She is a chartered sports and exercise psychologist with the British Psychological Society. She is currently working as a performance psychologist with a UK-based company called Grey Matters Performance. She is also a teaching fellow in sports psychologist at the University of Edinburgh. She has completed her PhD from University of Edinburgh, and the title of her PhD was Solving the Rubik's Cube of Indian Sports, Exploring Impactful Factors and Alternative Ways to Facilitate Success, wherein the focus was on exploring sports policies and sports coaching. The PhD concluded with her proposing a sports coaching model to develop sports coaches in India. It is a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Urvi.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Before we begin to ponder upon and discuss more about the topic for today, which is professional judgment and decision making in sports psychology, I would request Dr. Urvi to share a few insights from her journey as a sports psychologist.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great opportunity. So thank you very, very much. I'll quickly go through my journey of how I sort of moved through the different stages. I started off with doing my bachelor's in psychology from Fergusson College. Then I moved to the UK and did my master's in sport and exercise psychology from Loughborough University. I then started my accreditation with the British Psychological Society in sport and exercise psychology. I also started my PhD, which was like you covered in the introduction, was based on sport development in India. Now, generally talking about working as a sports psychologist in the UK, you have to be chartered. So you go through an accreditation process through which you get the status of a chartered sport and exercise psychologist. You can do that either through the British Psychological Society, or there's another pathway or another association called the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences. So either ways, you can do the accreditation pathway and get yourself chartered as a sport and exercise psychologist. The reason you need to do that is sports psychologist or sport and exercise psychologist as a title is protected in the UK, which essentially means that you can't call yourself a sport and or exercise psychologist without being chartered. So even getting internships can get very tricky if you're not on the pathway or already chartered. So if you are looking to come to the UK to pursue sport and exercise psychology, one of the things to keep in mind is what it would look like if you were to pursue sport and exercise psychology in the UK and want to practice here. Also, always remember that choosing a master's that is accredited by the British Psychological Society or BPS is something that's quite important to remember if you are planning to come to the UK, because that just keeps a few more options open for you if you were to stay here and pursue your chartership thereafter. After you've completed your chartership, there's again, you can obviously start working as a sport and exercise psychologist or a performance psychologist. You can obviously, if you've done a PhD like I did, you can also start working at universities as a teaching fellow or a lecturer or whatever other role that might be available. And obviously research is also a really key component that's very much valued. So that's again another area to be aware of and explore if you are interested in this sort of a career pathway.
Right, that sounds pretty interesting, and I'm sure the aspiring sports psychologists in India who want to pursue it in abroad might find this discussion to be very insightful and helpful for them. So thank you so much for providing that.
So this brings to my next question, that the topic that we're discussing today, which is professional judgment and decision making It's a very new topic for our listeners. So, can you walk us through what exactly is professional judgment and decision making?
Yeah, sure. So professional judgment and decision making, or PJDM, as it might be easier to refer to rather than kind of saying the whole thing often. So that's actually a process that helps practitioners plan the overall program of support or plan of consultancy. It also helps you design specific interventions and also work on moment to moment in action, session by session decisions within consultancies. So it basically acts like a scaffold or a structure that essentially helps the practitioner present their thoughts and allows them to actually engage in consistent reflective practice, which then helps them identify what I'm doing today in the session. How does that link to my overall consultancy plan? Because obviously, going into a consultancy, we might all have a particular plan that we are trying to work towards based on obviously client needs and the context as well. So what PJDM does is it helps us align our thought process and helps us reflect, which is a very, very key component of PJDM, reflective practice. So it helps us reflect on, okay, this is what I've done today. How does it link to my plan? Because obviously, when we go into a session, even if we might have a plan, maybe the client's context changes and we might need to do something differently. So essentially, PJDM then helps us reflect before, during, and after the consultancy to see how things align. So that also brings me to another key component within PJDM, which is called the nested planning. So the overarching aim links into a more meso level aim, which then links to a more micro or session by session aim. And the reason it's called nested is because it almost fits within each other. So it's almost like a nested set of tables. So how they all kind of fit within each other. That's essentially what the PJDM states. So simply speaking, it is an approach that helps practitioners make decisions before, so prior to the consultancy, during the consultancy, and after the consultancy as well. And yeah, like I said, reflective practice being a key thread going through the whole thing.
Yeah. So, like you mentioned, it's a process. More often than not, what happens is like as sports psychologists who are practicing on the field, we often come across situations which are a little complex and which need like a quick decision making. And we have like traditional approaches that we know that we can use, but when it comes to PJDM, what are the areas of application where it is more
Hmm.
beneficial
Yeah.
when we are faced with such situations?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the part that you said about complexity, so PJDM has often been misinterpreted as an approach that looks at whatever goes, use that, because it essentially focuses on the complexity, or it is often also looked at as an it depends approach. So whatever goes, PJDM states what it does state is that you need to obviously cater for the complexity that your client brings in, because your client is going to bring in loads of different factors, personal as well as situational factors. And like you said, you go into a consultancy, sometimes things do get very complex. So that's where you need to rely on more of a stronger knowledge base that you have to then make a decision that, okay, so for example, let's say you're working with an Olympic or an athlete preparing to go into the Olympics. You have a whole plan ready, your session plan's ready, you go in. Let's say your athlete ends up getting injured, which
Mhm.
brings in quite a bit of complexity in how you would then need to address it. So obviously what PJDM helps you do is, okay, so okay, getting to the Olympics is the overall aim. To get to that, we were working on, say, technical, tactical, psychological aspects of the athlete and strengthening those aspects. Now there's an injury. Okay, so now in today's session, I need to maybe prioritize how the athlete is feeling and getting them to maybe not spiral if that is what they are doing. So again, there's a thread that, okay, if that is what I was working on, that's what the 3 areas were. Now this has happened. Okay, maybe then technical, tactical doesn't take priority. I then go to, okay, I now need to focus on something else because that's the demand of the session. But then when I go back, I then reflect and say that, okay, so today I modified my session. So next session, we might need to look at some of the other components that we may not have touched upon today because there was a complexity that came through. So in terms of which area it is beneficial for, in terms of research and where PJDM has been used, obviously it's been used in sport and exercise psychology. Coaching is another area that it has been extensively researched in and is being used in. Strength and conditioning coaching, or rather strength and conditioning practitioners, they use it and have been researched quite a bit. If you were to trace the origins or some of the original work on this, it goes back to nursing actually. But yeah, so in terms of who can use it, practitioners in any really area can use it as a structure to help their thought process and help them reflect on what it is that they're trying to do and how does that link to whatever ultimately that they are trying to achieve. So what decisions can they take? It is about decision making, and it is about understanding, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? Could I have done a different approach maybe? If yes, what would make me choose a different approach? So it's again all about reflecting and trying to understand what is the best decision going into this situation based on obviously what the situation is and what other complexities that it does bring in. So yeah, a long answer, but it can be used by any of the practitioners. Like I said, the main research has been in the ones I mentioned. And again, the research obviously is increasing by the day. Practitioners in any of these fields can very much access and use the research and PJDM.
Yeah, very rightly said. Like a lot of time it happens. Like you spoke about Olympic level competition, even in like normal competitions that happens at state level or
Yeah,
national level, we come across a lot of athletes who just before the uh, main competition they have a ankle pain or some sort of injury that prevents them from actually participating in it, which brings me to the point of decision making. And what I find
yeah.
more often than not as practitioners we do is we go by the gut feeling. Okay, this
Mm.
sounds like a best decision in the moment, but I'm sure there must be some decision making types and processes that would be involved in decision making. So could you just talk about like
Yeah.
what comes into it?
Yeah. So PJDM essentially talks about sort of 2 frameworks or 2 types of decision making. Obviously, one is the more rapid, intuitive, like you said, on the go. The other one is the more slower and more deliberate type of decision making. So when you are formulating an overarching support plan, that's when the more slower, deliberate decision making would come in, or the naturalistic decision making. Um, because obviously at that point you've taken in all the information from your client, about your client, about your client's context. You're now trying to work all of that out with obviously your own psychology knowledge and trying to combine that to see, okay, what can be done? What are my clients' needs? How can I address those? What sort of plans can I have in this case? And then the more session by session is the one where you need to be very rapid and intuitive, which is the more classical decision making type thing. Sorry, the other way. The the slower is the classical decision making, and the faster or the intuitive one is the naturalistic decision making. The way it works is it relies on your own knowledge, and that also differentiates between experts and novices, because how you relate your knowledge to what's happening, and then what consultancy plan you might want to interpret and obviously then implement, all of this links back to what knowledge base you have and how you then formulate decisions based on that. So, for example, let's say you are working with a volleyball player, and one of the things that they struggle with is when they play in front of a crowd, they don't perform really well. But when they play maybe in maybe they play a game where there's not a large crowd, they play better. So obviously, if that's the situation that you are looking at, what comes in here as part of your knowledge, and that then links into some of the decision making that, or the decisions that you take, is okay, so same person performing differently, what's happening? It could be that they're getting distracted by the crowd. It could be things like them perceiving that, oh, if I don't play well, then the crowd will think this, say this about me. So obviously they're overly consumed by what the crowd will think. Not being able to play well or making mistakes in front of a big crowd could also maybe hint towards a bit of fear of failure. So based on the situation and the conversations you have with your client, there'll be loads of information you get, and it's about then you interpreting that information to then help you make the best possible decision. So those are essentially, it's either you're obviously using a more slower, deliberate, really well thought out decision making style, which obviously takes longer, and that's where all the reflecting and interpreting happens. And then that obviously helps you or provides a stepping stone for you to then make the more faster, intuitive decision making, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's like we have a lot of points to take care of when it comes to practicing PGDM in our practice areas. So, are there any key points that you would say that a practitioner should definitely keep in mind when they are adapting to or implementing PGDM in their practice?
Yeah, definitely. So the sort of three levels that you work at with PJDM, I have mentioned these before, but they are the macro or program level, meso or intention or intervention, and the third one is the micro or the session level. I'll again go off with the volleyball player example that I just spoke about. So let's say, based on your needs analysis, you've identified that focus and distraction control is an area that the athlete or the player needs to work on. So that comes at the program level, because that's the overall broad aim, that working on getting them to focus on the right things and avoiding them getting distracted by things that they shouldn't focus on. So that's the overall program level. Then when you come down to the meso or the intervention level, so this is what sort of things would you need to target to then make sure that you are still addressing the overall program level aim. And let's say the focus and distraction control is happening, or rather the athlete is getting distracted because they're overly focused on what other people think about their performance. In games, if they make a mistake, they dwell a lot on the mistake. So let's say those are the two key points that link into them being distracted during the game. Then when you come down to the meso level or the intervention level, Obviously, the kind of things that you will need to work on is incorporating things like pre-performance routines. So that could be mental imagery, that could be getting them to focus. So let's say they get distracted during a three-pointer, for example, because they've made a mistake, then focusing on getting them to focus on the process rather than spiraling into the thoughts. And then also things like rationalizing why does a crowd, or why does what other people think about them, what does that really mean to them? So that would be more on the intervention or the meso level. How that translates into the micro level is you could obviously use things like REBT, CBT to rationalize what's happening. You can obviously work on incorporating mental imagery so that they can then start using that as part of their pre-performance routines. You can use other strategies that help them focus on their own performance and their own process rather than getting distracted by, say, the crowd or who's watching and what's happening. So with PJDM, that's the key thing to remember, that there needs to be that link between what is it that you are trying to do and how does each of it link to each other. So after you've done your needs analysis, you know what the client needs are, what the client context is. That's when you really spend time on deciding and formulating the plan, and then dividing it into the other two layers which link, and then constantly reflecting on it after every consultancy to make sure that you are still achieving and targeting the overall program goal. So that golden thread must be there in PJDM essentially. And also obviously remembering that it's not, like I said, just use whatever works, but there's a lot of intricate decision making that goes in it. And there's obviously your knowledge base links into the kind of decisions you take prior to going into the consultancy, which then obviously link into and reflect on what happens during and after the consultancy as well.
That sounds pretty much like a lot of training goes back to adapting to this kind of a process in your practice. So, if any of our listeners or current sports practitioner or aspiring one wants to adapt or implement this into their practice, do they need to go through any training, or is there any protocol to follow through which they can adapt and implement that in their own workspace?
Yeah. So typically speaking, there's no, so like for some of the methods, there will be a formal like training available. For PJDM, there isn't a particular sort of training that you can use or undergo. It is obviously just experience using it, and making sure you are really giving genuine thought to what are you doing, why are you doing it, what other alternatives did you have, why did you choose the one that you chose against all the other alternatives, what in the situation would need to change for you to maybe go with a different alternative, and also at what point will you actually monitor the impact of what you're trying to do. So as much as it is about addressing your overall program aim, it's also reflecting on what impact is what I'm doing having on the whole consultancy program client. So it's giving genuine consideration to these sort of essentially big five things. So what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What alternatives did I consider? What needs to change for me to essentially look at a different and or implement a different alternative? And finally, when will I and how will I monitor the impact of what I have essentially implemented? So basically to answer your question, there is no formal training for PJDM. But obviously, the best way to do it is with somebody that has used it. So obviously, you know how your thought process is happening. So some guidance by somebody that has used it extensively. Obviously, there's, like I said, loads of research that has been done on PJDM in different fields. So getting access to that and seeing what sort of things and what sort of layers do we need to look at when looking at PJDM and or implementing PJDM. And obviously, the key also is relying on knowledge and strong base of knowledge, because that is what will help you make uh, whatever decision it is that you are trying to make. So making sure your knowledge base is really strong so that you can actually look at all the different components and then formulate the best possible decision based on that. So yeah, long answer to a very simplistic thing, that there's no formal so like for example, obviously for CBT or EBT you'll have formal training. There's not really any formal training for PJDM.
I think that was a pretty much detailed answer, and our listeners would have all their questions answered in that one particular detailed form of information. So that brings us to the conclusion of the session for today. Is there any food for thought that you would like to give to our listeners before we move on to the conclusion?
I think I have pretty much covered what I did want to, and I mean, it, yeah, if you look at it, yeah, it can look complex. It can look, yeah, basically the perceptions could vary from, oh, this looks really simple to, oh, this looks really complex as a concept. But it is about thinking about the nested plan, and it is about constant reflective practice. So it's not a case of, okay, I've made this plan on the 3 levels and I'm never going to go back to it. That again, that wouldn't fit within the PJDM structure. You would need to constantly reflect on it as you are going through with your consultancy. So yeah, nested planning, keep that sort of layers and see how those link. Spend lots and lots of time at the top end or the slow, deliberate decision making so that you are genuinely reflecting on what are you doing, why are you doing it, any other alternatives you could take, and why would you choose one over the other, what would make you change uh, the approach you've taken, and also how will you monitor what you're doing. So just really genuinely giving that a thought, and after the session, again, reflecting on, okay, this is what I did today. What does that mean and how does that fit in? Because again, like we spoke about, like session by session, everything is very dynamic. So using your knowledge scaffold to actually inform what you do at the session level, but then also reflecting and linking it back to the whole structure to keep it strong and coherent. So yeah, that's what I will say. And also generally every consultancy is different. So you will need to look at what the situation is before you decide on a plan. So that's another key thing that the PJDM states, that it depends on the context and it depends on what's happening in the context. Your decisions will depend on that. So remembering that it depends on the context rather than going in with, this is what I do and this is exactly how I'll follow it. Just take a step back, see what the situation is, and then make a decision of, okay, based on the situation, this is what I can do. That keeps it more sort of relevant to the situation, so to say. So that's how I'd sort of summarize what we've just said.
Pretty much the same thing. What I would have summarized, but this is for our listeners that we have come to the end of the episode, and it was good to learn so much about PGDM, which otherwise would not have happened just by reading articles. I'm sure our listeners are going to go and Google and research a bit more about it and start to adapt it. But the key point for listeners here is Try it under a supervised practitioner and practice it under their supervision. Reflect on
Yeah,
your journey and think about what you are doing, how you are doing it, and focus on the points that Dr. Urvi has already mentioned. And that would be like a good thing to start off with through the week. And thank you for listening to us. I hope to see you all on the next episode. And do follow us on our social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and also do, if you want to connect to Dr. Urdu, you can find it on her LinkedIn and Instagram, which will be mentioned in the description and the comment section. Thank you all for
great.
joining us. Thank you, Dr. Urdu,
Thank
for
you so
joining us.
much for Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, if any of the listeners want to also get in touch via email, more than happy to take that on as well. I'll send you my email if you want to put that through as well. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really lovely to chat to you about PJDM.
Thank you so much. See you all.